Always the tough one. That's right. So the MTI SBIR Technical Assistance Program supports pro bono small businesses in Maine who are interested in pursuing federal research and development grants, excuse me, for new and innovative technology that leads to product, processes, and services. So today I'd like to go ahead and start with the National Institutes of Health. Like I was saying earlier, the last week's session was on the general overview of the SBIR STTR program. And that video can be seen on YouTube. If you need the link, you can go to MTI's website and click on that under the federal funding webpage. Now I'd like to introduce Anne Goodnight, who is the former NIH SBIR STTR program manager, which is where I met her eons ago, from my point of view. But
when we were both 12.
We were both 12. We were very, very young. and now she's an independent consultant and has been consulting with MTI for years. So Joanne, I'll turn it over to you. If you have any questions, please put them in chat, and at some point we can always stop and get some questions answered, or we can go at the end. All right, Joanne.
Yep, thank you. And Karen, you said everybody but one attended last week?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Welcome back,
that's
everybody.
Great.
Okay.
Yeah, it's good.
Oops. Well, good morning, everybody. Then I won't spend a ton of time on this because you saw this slide last week, but for the person who didn't, very quickly, my background does go back to about 2.5 decades in the federal government. Most of that spent growing up at the NIH when I started when I was 12. I was also, in addition to the program manager, I was a researcher at the National Cancer Institute. And I have a little bit of experience with the Food and Drug Administration, and believe it or not, USDA, because I was a co-op student with Virginia Tech, and that's where I did my co-op. I've worked with other agencies, so just understanding their cultures. I have about 10 years in nonprofit and for-profit environments, most recently at the Jackson Laboratory, where I was director of sponsored research. And I did retire in October 2020 and moved from Maine back to Virginia to be closer to family and grandkids and all of those wonderful things, but I'm still very passionate about small businesses. And so I've continued to work with Karen in a consulting environment to really help you all with your proposals and hopefully help you succeed. My background is primarily in microbiology and immunology, as well as cancer genetics. So I'm glad that you guys came back for course number 2, I guess, of this grant writing webinar series. For today's objectives, I'd like to give a very brief anatomy lesson on the grant application. We'll help you understand how and why you need to fit your AIMS page into the grant planning timeline, overall grant timeline. To help you learn the primary components of writing a very strong specific AIMS page. Know your audience. This is going to be important for you to understand how the AIMS will ultimately link to peer review. And now next week, we'll do an entire session on the NIH peer review process, but I'll cover some of this today. I'll highlight some of the most common hiccups that occur with specific AIMS and leave you with relevant resources. And also we should have time for your questions because I want to be able to make sure everybody leaves here with those questions answered. And if we can't do it today, then we'll come back offline. Okay, a brief anatomy lesson on the grant application. So the application actually is 20 some odd components for NIH. This is, the project summary, the Ames page, which we're going to focus on today, the research plan, the literature citations, biosketches, et cetera. But for today's purposes, we really are going to drill right into the Ames. Now, I think it's really important that you understand how the Ames page fits into the timeline. As you could imagine, on an ideal day, you're going to be dedicating the next 6 to 8 months of writing your planning and writing and submitting your application. Now, in reality, we're probably like looking at 2 to 3 months. So a lot of that gets compressed, but we're going to talk in the ideal world. In that 7 to 8 months, 6 to 8 months period, this is where you should really be brainstorming about your idea, assessing, do you have all the resources in-house to carry out the proposed research, or are you going to have to outsource some of the work? And I'm going to bet that the majority of you will need to outsource. I remember when I was at NIH, I did a little data analysis and figured out that something like 75 to 80% of SBIRs actually had a subcontract of some type. So it's fine to outsource, just assess what your resources are and where you need to complement those by going outside. And then importantly, this is the time where you want to contact NIH program staff. Now, if you're in that 2 to 3 month of, look, we're planning to submit for April, that doesn't mean you still can't contact NIH staff. But the takeaway here is this is where you want to be drafting your Ames page. Doesn't have to be perfect, but this is just enough to share with the program staff that we can contact them and get a dialogue going to understand, based on your specific aims, do you fit within that institute? Are you addressing a particular funding opportunity and being responsive to it, et cetera? And then in the 2 to 6 month time period before submission, you're going to be outlining your research plan, writing, rewriting, getting it reviewed by us. Very, very iterative process. In addition to that research plan, you'll be working on a slew of admin pieces, developing your budget justification, defining key personnel and what their % effort will be, writing biosketches and obtaining biosketches from any subs that you've got, preparing your facilities and resources document, and any writing letters or having your collaborator write those letters of support. There's a lot that goes on, which is why you can imagine, yes, we're often burning the candle at both ends, but in the ideal world, if you've got that 6 to 8 month period ahead of the actual due date, you can do all these things. And in reality, we often squeeze it into 2 to 3 months. That's the nature of the business. And then more like 2 months ahead, you'll be getting feedback, doing a lot of proofreading, editing, as I said. There might be internal deadlines within your company that say we've got to have all of these documents by this date. I can tell you with university subs, they will often say, we have our own internal deadlines. We need to have things like budget and budget justification and statements of work done a good 3 to 4 weeks ahead of the due date. And then you hit that sort of last run of the race, and as you're working toward the receipt date, and you submit. So a lot is happening all throughout this timeline. But as I said, the big takeaway is get that draft Ames done. It doesn't have to be 100% spot on, but just enough to help guide the conversation with the program staff. So before you begin, you need to be able to answer these 3 questions. What are you going to do? Like, what is your research question? And it needs to be very strong. And I know in SBIR and STTR, you're talking technology development, but there's still a research component, research and development component to this. Why is it important to do this work? I mean, really, who cares? This is the so what question. And what happens if you are successful in completing your technology development? And then there's the how. How are you going to do it? And inclusive in that is, how is this approach innovative? What's novel about it? So we'll start to drill into these. Some basics. The specific aims are, in fact, the most important part of the application. The reviewers need to really love your idea by the time they finish reading that page. It's going to provide a technical overview of your project and therefore serve as a roadmap for your entire proposal. And in all of that, you're persuading the reviewers that the project is important. You've highlighted the scientific premise. You've convinced them that the project has really strong impact and novelty and feasibility, that you're the right person or have the right team to do the work, and that the project has high impact to advance science and meet the NIH mission. So I can't underscore enough that this is the most important component of any grant proposal. The reviewer usually reads this first page and really gains a general impression of the entire project to be done and the means of approaching the questions proposed. Now, if the reviewer is really interested and excited by the project after reading this, they're likely going to be a little less critical of the details in the approach section. That's all relative. They're still going to be critical because they love chewing up the research plan, but you've excited them and they want to keep reading. So the aims should really be written in such a way to generate enthusiasm, interest, and excitement among the entire review group, not just among the 2 or 3 reviewers assigned to your proposal. And so a highly polished aims page is really going to influence how the reviewers, because they're all voting on it, will judge the entirety of the grant. Okay, so the aims page is really going to be an iterative process. You want to write it first, and then you just keep revising it as your research plan develops. That's perfectly fine and absolutely normal for that process to be iterative. Your aims should test your hypothesis if you do indeed have one, or support your technology development objective. And there needs to be some detail, but not too much. All right. And then each of your aims really should have a milestone. It's because at the end of each one, you're going to have something you can really measure. Those aims need to be logical and related to one another, but independent of one another. And the outcome needs to be informative regardless of the outcome. So writing an aims page is really akin to thinking of a salesperson with a really cool idea. You're well prepared, you're credible, you make a really good first impression, you provide supporting documentation, you have something special to offer that no one else is really offering. You present a logical, well thought out plan, you're inspiring and really conveying confidence in the approach. And you're able to explain the background of your idea. And this is a really nice little, I'm giving you the reference, the jewel in the crown specific aims section of the investigator initiated grant proposals. Think of this too as a linear progression of logic. You identify the gap, you highlight the objective of this proposal, you then come in with your central hypothesis or the overall goal. Again, I know not every SBIR, STTR is hypothesis driven, nor does it need to be, but I'm seeing more and more that hypotheses are being stated, which is perfectly fine. You just need to be able to defend it as you're writing that research plan. Then you go a little more focused into the specific aims, and if successful in carrying out those aims, you define the expected outcomes. And all of that should link right back into the gap that you originally identified. Okay, so let's go into the primary components of a strong aims page. This is one page with essentially 4 paragraphs. There's an opening, there's a what, why, who, there's the actual aims, and there's a payoff paragraph. And I'm going to go through each one of these in more detail. But basically, the opening is comprised of the hook, a statement of knowledge, statement of the gaps in what's known, and a highlighting of the critical need. In the what, why, who paragraph, you're really giving the big picture, the long-term overall goal of your project, the main objective or central hypothesis, your rationale for why you want to do it. Remember my original first 3 questions. And if there's room, a little bit on the team. And then the 3rd paragraph is very emphatically what those specific aims are and any supporting details for how you're going to do the work, but not too much detail. And I'll underscore that over and over. And then your last paragraph is the payoff, where you will explain the expected outcomes and the impact. You want this first page to be that page turner of the novel, maybe 50, 60, 80 pages that you prepared in this full application. Okay, so opening paragraph, you want to establish the science problem. Create an exciting, what I call that hook sentence, to really quickly capture the reviewer's attention. Ground the readers. So you've got 3 assigned reviewers, but you've got maybe 10, 12 others who are reading and listening at review. So you want to state what's currently known to ground all of them. Explain the knowledge gaps and convey that your research is going to fill that gap, and really convey a sense of importance or urgency to this. And then you want to state the critical unmet need. So this is where you're emphasizing the significance of the problem. Remember, as I said last week, and I'll highlight next week, significance is one of the 5 review criteria. So you're really starting to kind of ground the reviewers even in the significance, and convey that your research has been presented in a logical way that will advance the field. So the aims section really in one page has to include everything about your application that's important and exciting, but without tons of detail, because you're going to have that research strategy to go into the full details. It has to provide a conceptual framework on which your assigned reviewers, 2 or 3, can orally hang the details of what is proposed, because they're going to have to talk about this proposal to their peers during peer review. And so the aims, together with significance and innovation, is really one of the most important parts of the application in terms of capturing a positive vote from the majority of the reviewers. And the way to start crafting this, I would suggest, is go back to 4th grade and start to use an outline and a bulleted way of writing to help answer these questions. So at this point, reviewers should really understand the medical relevance, be up to speed with current knowledge, and understand what the gap is in knowledge that's constituting an important problem that you're solving. So then we go to the 2nd paragraph, the what, why, who. Okay, you want to state your long-term goals. The purpose here is to give the big picture. This, what's the continuum of research that you'll pursue over the course of multiple periods of grant support? Let's say phase 1, phase 2, phase 2B. and convey it in a realistic way over a finite period of time. So let's say the focus is cancer. Well, your long-term goal isn't going to be, I want to cure cancer, right? But maybe it's to improve the detection of a particular cancer, ovarian cancer, or improve detecting breast cancer lesions in a more concise and rapid manner. Then you want to state your main objective. All right, this component defines the purpose of your grant application, not the big picture, but now you're getting a little more focus into your grant application. So it must be to fill a gap or meet the need that you've discussed in your first paragraph. You also want to emphasize the product that you're developing. And I strongly recommend that you have some sort of name for your product. It's difficult, sometimes when it's a very long descriptor, but at the end of the day, when you're successful, you're going to have a name for your device, your technology. So what do you plan to achieve in this proposal? And now you want to explain your rationale and highlight the scientific premise. All right, so the rationale is you being able to convey why you want to undertake the proposed research. And it should tell reviewers, what's really going to become possible after the research is completed. That's not possible now. Once the R&D is completed, you'll be able to fill that gap. And this is really your opportunity to excite the reviewers. How did you arrive at your objective, or hypothesis? Is there published literature? Are there past studies? And this is where you start to very explicitly say the scientific premise for this work is the following. Make it easy for them to find this information, because in their review, they've got very specific questions that they'll be answering, and they're going to look for this information in your proposal. And you want to make it easy to find that. As I said, briefly state what successful completion of the proposed work would make possible. And understanding you only have one page, and it's sometimes tricky, but if possible, talk about the qualifications of your team and why the experimental design and you/your team are the best ones to accomplish the main objective. Okay, so then we get into the aims page. This is actually sometimes the hardest part of the aims page to write, because you have to use really, really clear, active headlines that link you back to the main objective or central hypothesis. They should not be descriptive. So avoid words like, we're going to compare this or correlate this. Frankly, I think it's okay to say we're going to investigate, but I think the point here is to make it a little more active and linked to the ultimate outcome that you'll describe. So you'll give those aims active titles. Each of your aims should tie to your objective to test your hypothesis or objective. The aims should be related, but cannot be dependent upon one another. I apologize. I think some of my words are being hidden. Okay. The failure of one aim must not prevent the success of another aim from being successful, or the failure of one aim must not prevent the success of another aim. Describe the experimental approach. All right. And so this is just going to be maybe 2 to 3 sentences each, because you're going to run out of space pretty quickly. This will include a brief summary of your technical approach, a milestone for each aim. Remember, this has to be something measurable. And then specifically state for each aim what your expected outcome will be. Now, the payoff paragraph. This is often an overlooked yet very, very vital section for impact. It creates a firm broad base to support your proposal. This is where you might want to restate or underscore what's innovative about your project and what would your technology bring to the field that's not currently available. This is where you want to highlight the expected outcomes and include some type of statement that says, what the positive impact will be by addressing the knowledge gap. So this last paragraph really informs the reviewers what they can expect for a return on the government's investment if they vote a strong score, i.e. recommend supporting your project. For expected outcomes, they want to see very explicitly what that expected product will be. And as I said, really summarize the general impact of the expected outcome. They'll sometimes take that impact statement and plop it right into the summary statement because you're making it easy for them to do their job. So I'll give you a few examples. Let's see, I'm going to see if I can minimize. Oh, perfect. Because the the webinar is, or the Zoom is covering my title slides. Okay, so an example of specific aims. This is a phase 1 STTR. The title of this project is Lead Compound Discovery from Engineered Analogs of Basidiofungin. They start right out stating the research problem, that hook statement. And so I've circled that here. Basidiofungins, isolated from Burkholderia, blah, blah, are a newly discovered class of antifungals. And then they go into the statement of knowledge. They talk a little bit about their own characterization studies and what those studies revealed. Now, they're not giving all of the data here because that's going to be in your research strategy, but just enough to give them a little teaser on what's to come. They talk about the gap in knowledge and that there's a critical need to isolate and characterize the bioactivity and toxicity of each of these analogs, et cetera, and that the potential to develop new clinically useful approaches to mitigate human susceptibility to infections will likely remain limited unless we further understand the therapeutic potential of these compounds. It's a really nice opening in just a very few number of sentences. And what you've got here are the references, and you can get the entire application that the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases has provided to help you see how these are written. Okay, let's see. Oops. Yep. Then we go into the who, what, why. So they start off with the long-term goal. It's to develop a treatment option, alternative treatment option for serious fungal infections. And then they start really to ground the reviewers for this particular proposal. Our objective in this application is to characterize these analogs of basidiofungin. Our central hypothesis is that one of these has a superior set of qualities, et cetera. This hypothesis was based on our preliminary data. So now they're starting to highlight the scientific premise. In my opinion, at some point they should use those exact words because the reviewers will be looking for the words scientific premise. And the rationale they go into covers the why they want to do this. Okay, that there needs to be a lead compound identified to ensure success before our pre-IND meeting with FDA. Okay, then they go into the segue very nicely into the actual specific aims paragraph. I like that in this particular example, they put the objective right there for the reviewers to see. And then they go into a very clear statement of aims 1 and 2, and provide some supporting detail. And again, just enough to give the reviewers a little bit about the methodology, about how they're going to, for example, screen for these semi-synthetic analogs, and how they will evaluate the possibility of producing acetiofungans by solid phase. Okay. So a very nice way of laying out the aims. Aim 1, to synthesize, engineer, and isolate structural analogs of acetiofungin. Aim 2, now they're going to characterize the bioactivity. Now, one might say, well, isn't aim 2 completely dependent upon aim 1? In this case, they've already got enough data that they've really convinced the reviewers that aim 1 is very likely to succeed. And so the logical step is to characterize those analogs. Then they get to the payoff statement. All right. At the completion of these studies, we expect we will have identified a lead compound of acetiofungin that has the best attributes for preclinical testing. And then they talk about the positive impact. They do have a little team comment here. We are well equipped with the knowledge and experience to successfully complete this proposal. See bio sketches attached, right? So it's just enough to give the reviewers confidence that you've thought about all of the requisite talent that needs to help carry out this proposed work. So this is a phase 1 SBIR example. PANDAA, or PANDA, for Universal Panlineage Molecular Detection of Loss of Fever Infection. Now, in this opening, they give a little bit on background and significance. I find this interesting because 20 years ago, the reviewers wanted to see a background and significance section in the research strategy. So this might be someone who's kind of had early on experience with NIH, and they haven't really gone away from some of these subtitles, but that's okay. The bottom line is they still come in with a hook statement about loss of virus, causing 2 million infections, 10,000 deaths, threatening global health security. And so it captures the reviewer's attention. And then they go into the statement that rapid and accurate diagnosis is critical to global health efforts. They highlight the knowledge, what's currently known, the WHO prioritizing development of a vaccine against Lassa, but where the gaps are. Current diagnostics do not provide reliable incidence or distribution data and are insufficient for any future vaccine efficacy study. And then they go on to talk about other barriers to success of these diagnostics. They highlight the critical need. And I will say in this particular example, much of 1 through 4, the hook through critical need, are really better described in the significance section, but it's there, and the reviewers will find it in their research plan. So everybody's kind of got a slightly different style, but they're doing a fairly good job here. And you know what? This application got a really strong score, so it's okay to sometimes deviate a little bit from my recommended paragraph setups. The who, what, why, they actually talk about the long-term goal in their payoff section. But here they highlight the innovation, they highlight preliminary data, and a little bit about the approach. Okay, and then they go right into the aims, which are really nicely laid out. They're designing these primers and probes. They're refining the reagents on divergent genotypes. They're doing an analytical and clinical validation. These are just really, really strong words of this Panda LSV diagnostic prototype. So they provide just enough supporting details here about how they're going to approach these aims. And again, more of the details will be highlighted in the research plan. And the other thing I like here is that they've laid out the months that they plan to do these. Now, in an ideal world, aim 2 should overlap a little bit with aim 1, aim 3, maybe with aim 2. If the reviewers are going to come in hard, they're going to say, is one of these aims dependent upon the success of the other? Because of the way they've highlighted their months. But in fact, that's not what happened. And this was viewed as kind of like a logical progression. Then they get their payoff statement. Here's where they emphasize the long-term goal of the project and expected outcomes and the impact. So just another different way to do these. Here's another example. This is a phase 1 SBIR, high throughput multiplex characterization and modeling of antibody antigen binding with application to HSV. Again, they start right out with the hook. They want to grab the reviewers' attention and keep them reading. They talk about what's currently known about the problem and where the knowledge gaps are. And then in so many words, they highlight the critical need, more experimentally tractable methods such as alanine scanning and pairwise antibody blocking do not provide nearly as rich or robust information. Then they go into that second paragraph, highlighting the long-term goal, the main objective and central hypothesis, and the rationale. Okay. This is really where reviewers are going to focus into, they're going to jump right into the aims. So now that you've grounded them, what are the aims for this? Define communities of antibodies with similar antigen binding patterns, localize antibody epitopes. And then they come I love this because they say the strength of the premise is, and they really give a couple, 2 or 3 sentences to highlight that. Reviewers will copy and paste that right into the summary statement. Like, thank you very much for making this easy. In the summary statement, one reviewer commented, the 2 aims are clearly articulated and build on each other. First, the investigators will define clusters of antibodies with similar antigen binding patterns, and then seek to map the epitopes onto hotspot residues. Like, they've read enough of this one page to be able to restate the 2 aims in their own words. And I like that. Oh, one other thing. Including a little graphic on your aims page can be so helpful. This is not a huge picture. It's not taking up a ton of space, but it's just enough to give the reviewers a visual also of what the work is entailing. And then their payoff section, they really come in strong with the innovation, highlighting the unmet clinical need and potential health impact, and the team and outlook. So I've put sort of that lighter blue color here where they're highlighting the team. It doesn't necessarily matter where this information is on that one page, but just make it very clear where it, wherever it is, how you're addressing those blocks that I've provided to you. Okay, now let's look at a phase 2 SBIR. This is a point of care HIV antigen antibody diagnostic device. Their opening comes in with a really nice hook to grab the attention of the reviewers. All right, HIV infection remains a major public health crisis in the US and worldwide. et cetera, then they kind of start to focus it down about the statement of knowledge and moving into the critical need. Now note this paragraph that I've put on the bottom here is actually in the significant section of the research plan. Some of it probably could have been brought up into the aims page. But at the end of the day, that information was there. They had some, good graphics and figures in that research plan. And it was probably just enough in this aims page to keep them reading. In the second paragraph, they talk about their company, that they're developing a point of care infectious disease testing platform. They're highlighting kind of their long-term goal and the rationale here. All right, so here we propose an inexpensive device that delivers this performance, et cetera, et cetera. And I like that they're saying we're building on the successes of our phase 1 because they're being reviewed based on what they proposed in phase 1 to see whether they were successful in those aims. And we propose continuation of our translational research on a novel system, offering these 3 highlighted bullets. Very succinctly laid out. Then they go into their aims. Slightly different way of writing the aims. This one is not necessarily nice little headlines and active statements, but I think for a device, this is not atypical and it's perfectly fine. Aim 1 is focused on assay development. Aim 2 on cartridge integration. Aim 3 on assay validation. If you don't have a validation component in a device that you're developing, the reviewers are going to hammer you on that. And then their aim 4 focuses on pre-market field evaluation. Okay, so very, very nicely done. Again, these applications scored extremely well and were indeed funded by NIH. Their payoff, they actually come in here with the team statement. The group of investigators is uniquely capable. Look at these words they're using, right? Of executing this project in a timely and cost-efficient manner. They talk a little bit about the PI, they talk a little bit about the team without giving their whole bio sketch because there's an entire section for including those. And then the expected outcomes and impact paragraphs are really in the commercialization plan, which is required for phase 2, as you know. Some of this could have been brought into the aims page, but it's there and the reviewers really do have to read the commercialization plan. So the information was easily found. Karen, do we want to, let me see how we are with time. I could keep going or I don't know if there's, looks like there's one question in the chat, but you want me to keep going?
We can, I'll put it out to you guys, to the attendees. Do you have any questions for a minute or two to ask Joanne? That way she can have a sip of coffee or water or something.
And if not, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure that people had the chance.
Right. Okay, let's keep going.
Okay. So I tried to give you kind of a structure off of which you're going to make bulleted outlines. Again, I keep going back and, I say 4th grade, but that's where at least I learned to do outlining. And it really helps to keep you focused on those particular sections because one page gets eaten up really quickly. And if you have information that doesn't need to be there, then by bulleting and outlining, you're going to eliminate all of that noise. So if I look at past summary statements and try to tease out what some of the reviewers have said, I've come up with a list of common problems with the aims page. It's just poorly written. and know that reviewers aren't going to want to hunt for this information. They don't want to sit there and read and reread to understand what it is you're trying to say. The aims are dependent upon one another. I think I've highlighted that enough. It's too ambitious and too much work for the phase that's being proposed. I mean, for phase one, if you're asking for 6 months or 1 year, you don't write an aims page. It's really going to encompass your phase one, phase two, phase 2B, right? So this is just enough work for that particular phase. The aims are unfocused with unclear goals. There's a weak scientific premise, or maybe that scientific premise is not even stated at all. You haven't convinced them that you've got a compelling rationale for doing this work. They view it as being not significant and having incremental or low impact research in the field. Unclear innovation. I mean, this is the SBIR and STTR programs. You really have to make clear to them why this is novel, why it's innovative. So now I'm going to go into kind of knowing your audience. Your audience are your peers. These are peer reviewers who are coming from academia and industry. They will ideally demonstrate having the following that will best ensure the best review of your application. First and foremost, they've got to have the scientific expertise. They need to have mature judgment. They actually need to be able to work in a group sometimes, and especially now with all of these review meetings being conducted via Zoom, you've got to be able to defend, something that you're saying about the proposal, and then another reviewer comes in and says, well, I read that a little differently. You don't know what you're talking about. I mean, they don't get that direct, but sometimes you can sense some uneasiness within the group. And so they really need to be able to work effectively. And the scientific review officer who's convening that group needs to monitor that. All right. If you've got an outlier in there, they need to monitor and be able to talk to that person off to the side and say, you can be an outlier, but you need to explain the why in your summary statement. They need to have breadth of perspective. They need to be impartial. Diversity is very important, whether it's geographical diversity or population diversity. So those are both very, very important, and things that NIH takes pretty seriously. And honestly, this is why the peer review system works extremely well at NIH. More on the peer reviewer. So you need to keep front and center what's going to make the reviewer look forward to reading the rest of your grant application. This is their phenotype. They're overworked, they've got labs to run, and they're now volunteering for $250 to read, let's say 8, 10, 12 applications. So they're busy. They're tired, they're having to multitask. They may not be familiar or expert in the scientific area of your grant. Now, the primary reviewer and secondary reviewer and reader will be, but you've got an entire review group. They come in inherently skeptical. What can I find wrong with this application, right? That's just their nature. They're likely past NIH grant recipients and actually have active grants, and they're accomplished. And more importantly, they're dedicated to this process, and they want to see you succeed, but also don't waste their time, and they'll make it clear if they feel like you're doing that. Like, let me just throw this grant application in and see what the reviewers say, and then I'll use that to help me retool for my resubmission. Also remember, a reviewer comes to a conclusion about you, about the significance of your idea, the clarity of your thinking after one page. That's it, the specific aims page. If you didn't write that one well, they're going to struggle to get through your research plan. And they just don't have the time to reread it to understand what you really intended, as I said a slide or two ago. Each reviewer is assigned multiple applications. I think it was 3 to 5. It may be actually more than that today. And so it's hundreds of pages that they're consuming and trying to really make sense of what you're proposing. They want to be thorough, but they know with a limited amount of time, they've got to move quickly and be efficient. And they really will spend, 3 to 4 hours reviewing each application. So don't make it difficult. So you're spending what on an ideal day, 8 months in preparation. In realistic daytime, probably spending 2 to 3 months. So that's many, many hours that you're spending writing it. They're now reviewing it. At the review meeting, they may only discuss your application for 10, 15 minutes. So it's very, very much an efficient process. But you don't want them, acting like, I'm so confused, I'm just going to move on to the next application, because hopefully that one's going to make it easier for me to read. Also understand, reviewers not assigned to review your proposal, they're playing catch up during the presentation by those assigned reviewers. And so they're going to be looking at the abstract, the aims page, the significance and innovation. The majority of reviewers won't have read your proposal before it comes up for evaluation. Now, I'm speaking outside of those assigned primary, secondary, and reader. Yet they have an equal vote in establishing your priority score. Okay, so they will want to make an informed vote and not be directed, hey, give this a 1.7 or give it a 3 or a 9 because they totally didn't understand the significance. So they'll be playing catch up and reading parts of your proposal while also listening. Remember I said multitasking, there's a lot of that going on. The aims are providing that conceptual framework. And so the flow of logic has to be even more compelling than anywhere else in the proposal, and so compelling that the reviewers can follow it at a meeting while someone else is talking. It's like following conversations at our dinner table back in the day when, I'm Italian and we'd have like 3 or 4 different conversations going on, discussions and debates, and you got to pay attention to everything. Okay. What do you think is the core or fundamental attribute that reviewers look for in your aims page of your grant or grant application? It's not a grant till it's funded. The overall impact, which is the likelihood for the project to exert a sustained, powerful influence on the research field involved. I know one of the questions that Karen shared with me was how much space do I dedicate to impact? The impact score is really going to encompass the 5 review criteria: significance, innovation, approach, investigators, and environment. So you're going to be really threading the whole impact throughout your application. All right. And the reviewers want to make sure that there's going to be a good return on the government's investment. Right. So this just highlights what I said. The overall impact takes into consideration the 5 review criteria, as well as any additional review criteria as applicable. So in the funding opportunity announcement, if it's just the general omnibus, there won't be special review criteria, but NIH is more and more using these NOCs, notice of special interest, or they'll release a special program announcement or request for application. I think I talked about that last week. And in there may be, in addition to the 5 core criteria, reviewers will assess the following. And so your aims page needs to be focused on this core realization. All right, and we'll go through this in much more depth next week on the peer review process. Okay, so it's a lot of information. Let's pause here and talk about some takeaways. The Aims page really becomes your template for the rest of the research plan. You ought to be able to print it and look at it as you're writing the research plan, which is your approach, innovation, etc. You want to include everything about the proposal that's exciting and compelling, but without tons of detail, because you're going to run out of space. And by doing that, you won't have covered some of the other really important areas that I highlighted. Your logic must be clear and compelling and readily flow from each component. Give it to some of your peers. If they don't understand what you're doing, give it to me and Karen, which you're doing. If we don't understand the flow, we're going to let you know that and help you rewrite so that the logic is clear. Start with an outline in a bulleted fashion to ensure the flow and that you've eliminated, like I call it, the noise, any unnecessary detail. Create that hook starter sentence that's going to really pique the interest of the reviewers, as well as establish relevance to the NIH mission. So that current knowledge component grounds the assigned reviewers, but importantly, the less knowledgeable reviewers on your topic, and it sets up what the unmet need is. It's okay to include citations, literature citations in your Aims page, but make sure they're the key ones, because your significant section is going to have a lot of others. That gap in knowledge or unmet need paragraph, that really needs to tie back to the current knowledge that you've stated. The what, why, and the who section takes the reviewer from this broad overall goal to the narrowest focus of the application. So you have a credible long-term big picture goal, and you have an objective that describes the particular product of research that you're proposing in this phase 1 or this phase 2 or fast track. The central hypothesis links to the objective and provides a focus to your research, and then starts to set up the aims. More takeaways. The scientific premise is clearly stated and explicitly stated with a bold or an underline. The rationale describes what's really going to be possible after you successfully complete the research. This is the part that excites the reviewers, The aims paragraph describes tasks to accomplish the objective. It's brief, it's informative. You use these attention-getting headlines of, what will be done. And the payoff paragraph, don't give it short shrift, because this is going to highlight the expected results, and really there should be at least one important outcome for each of your aims. And you can summarize that all in the payoff paragraph. It doesn't have to be after each aim. The payoff paragraph can really nicely capture those outcomes at the very end. And then that provides a nice segue to the significance and innovation sections, which will be the next page as they turn in your application. How best to understand the peer review process? Become the audience, right? If you want to really know how to write good applications, what really good aims page or not so good aims pages look like, volunteer to serve on a study section. And the way to do that is to contact the scientific review officer, share your CV. Now, they'll typically want you to have an active grant, so it might be premature for some of you, but down the road, they're always looking for reviewers. And these are these study sections are called ad hoc, and so they are assembling them based on the research being proposed. So, you might be called upon just to review a couple of applications in the very beginning. But it's a great way to give back. It's a great way to learn the process from the inside. Some resources. So there's a first bullet here is on writing your specific aims. This is a really nice article from published on NLM's PubMed and a link to UTexas on specific aims. NIH Reporter is a great way. It's a database of all of NIH's funded projects. You can search that database using activity codes for phase 1, which is R43, or phase 2, which is R44 SBIR. And then when you get your list of projects, you can click on the hyperlinks and read the abstracts. And within the abstract, there will be a description of the specific aims. So even the abstract, the project summary, will tie into your aims page. They're all very, very nicely linked when these are well written. NIAID has numerous sample applications that you can look at. The Center for Scientific Review, which is that one component, as I mentioned last week, that doesn't make funding decisions, but they're the ones responsible for organizing the review of your application. They've got some really nice guidance on review, and they call it the Insider's Guide. Yours truly and Karen as well, from the TAP team, we're really here to help you succeed in this program. So I started out with an objective slide. I hope that I've been successful in checking off all of these areas, and hope that I've kind of spurred some new questions to answer. So let me pause there. I'll open the chat. Thanks, Anne.
Yeah, there was one question from Kathy in chat that said, if work addresses not only an NIH priority, but has additional benefits, should those be noted and where?
Absolutely. So when you say NIH priority, to me, priorities of NIH are at a high level to improve the health of the American public. Now, some institutes will release a request for applications. And let's say it's the Deafness Institute. And they may say, a priority for us is we need technology that improves upon hearing aids, or models the ear for improved implants for toddlers. That's a priority of theirs, and that complements their general list of topics, where every institute's last topic will say other areas within our mission. So I'm distinguishing this from DoD, who says these are our priority areas and we need companies to respond to this and develop product in this period of time, and we'll issue a contract. NIH, it's not that they don't have priority areas, they absolutely do. And that I would encourage you to read their strategic plan for whatever institute you are focused on. And this leads me to another comment that I should have made earlier. In your significance section, or even in the aims page, you can say this is responsive to one of the priorities highlighted in Institute X's strategic plan. Now, if it has additional benefits, you can note those throughout your application. in the impact section of your aims page, in the significance section, in the end of the research plan. Like, redundancy is no vice here, where you're threading certain themes about the benefits of the outcome of your research.
Great, thank you, Joanne.
Mhm.
So again, significance is where you can really expand on the other opportunities.
Yep.
Having listened to all of this, I've got to say, I should say, Maine companies are so incredibly lucky to have you as a resource for NIH applications. And I should say, Joanne is not limited to just working with companies for NIH applications, but DoD has a strong medical component. National Science Foundation also has a pretty strong medical device biotech section. She can work on any of those sort of proposals in reviewing to ensure that it's medically relevant and appropriate. So it's, we've always said, never judge an agency by its name. There are a lot of opportunities outside of NIH, but NIH has such specific requirements. And the focus is, as Joanne said last week, mostly on the science, particularly in phase 1. And then in phase 2, you talk more and more about commercialization. Okay, opening it up to our attendees. Any questions that you may have? Well, you're either going to unmute yourself or put it in the chat, that's fine. I was going to say, from a business point of view, the NIH reporter, besides providing all of that information about who's been funded, it also is a good resource for testing out whether or not your technology is really innovative. And that's important because you're going to find out, first of all, if it's been funded in the past, if so, by whom, and if that company is in your space, now you know that company is a potential competitor. And so one of the things you're going to have to address is, how can you differentiate your technology from what NIH has already funded, which is really, really important. So make sure that you use the NIH reporter as a resource to see what institutes are funding. Any comments along those lines, Joanne?
I would add that don't be discouraged if somebody is working on a technology that is similar to what you're developing. I mean, NIH will fund multiple companies, multiple organizations, and hope that, there's success in all of them. If you do find someone working in a similar area, in a phase 2, you're going to have a competitor section, but in a phase 1, I would make it very clear, like, again, in the significance section, maybe, or you can squeeze a little section in about the landscape and say why your technology may have a slight advantage over what's currently there. And also I would make the point, just because it's being funded right now doesn't mean that, or likely means, the product has not yet been developed. So those two are very, very different things. They're still doing R&D as well, but the reviewers like to know that you've done your homework to find out who else is working in the field, who are the competitors, make sure your literature citation isn't just 10 references. It should be much more than that. You've done a really good deep dive of the field and know who's working in it.
Good. Any other questions, thoughts, comments on the process of developing your specific aims? Joanne and I are available for calls and discussions about specific aims. The way that you can work with us is to go to maintechnology.org, click on the Get Started tab, and then fill out an intake form. In that intake form, there's a drop-down box, and one of them is, I'm writing an SBIR, and I want TAP support. So that gets you into MTI's system, and that allows us to go through SBIR. The first stage is what we call SBIR discovery. So we'll talk with you about the technology, we'll review all of the NIH topics, and we can help you craft those specific aims that you're going to send to the program officer to have that discussion to ensure fit. Now, one of the really nice things about NIH is I see mostly that the program officers are really quite helpful. And Joanne, you can probably talk to that better than I can. So, because, sometimes people have this qualm or a little concern about, oh, I'm calling a federal official and, what do I say to that person? So I thought maybe you could talk about that.
Sure. Yeah, the program staff, as I said, really, they're that point of contact early on to help guide you. They'll read your aims page. Every one of them is very different. So they're not going to rewrite your aims page for you, because you could imagine, and this has happened, where they say, you know what, I would drop aim 2 and I would just focus on aim 1 and change aim 3 to this and this, and then leave the rest for phase 2. And then it goes to review, and the reviewers are like, I would have had a lot more enthusiasm about this if they had done X. And guess what? It was aim 2 that got dropped. So the program people don't want to be put in that position, nor should they. Their role is not to serve on as peer reviewers. That said, they can be very helpful in terms of letting you know what typically fares well, what study section might be best to review your application. We'll talk more about this next week, how you can help guide that as well. But the long and short is they want to have success stories in their grant portfolio. So they're going to be as helpful as possible. And the more time you give them, the better, to really kind of start that partnership with them, and don't be bubblegum on their shoe, but contact them early and relatively often, keep them updated, and it plays out in your favor. They might be down to the end of the fiscal year and say, I can actually fund 3 more applications because either money freed up or whatever the reason. And I remember this company staying in contact with me. I'm going to reach out to them, ask how things are going, and they may select you based on some prior conversations that you've had. So they're there to help you. They want to be your advocates, and they want to write about you as a success story.
Excellent. Great. Thank you, Joanne. Right. It's 11:15. Any other questions?
Hey, Karen, I think there's one in the chat that you didn't answer.
I didn't see. Okay, let's have a look at it. There we go. Do you have a sense of how reviewers view an over-the-counter end product versus a pharmaceutical product?
I don't believe reviewers would have any bias toward one versus the other. If it's, if it's over the counter, I mean, I don't know 100% about what all the processes are for getting that approved versus, I mean, I'm a little confused by the question because there are some pharmaceutical products that are over the counter. So like Voltaren, which used to be only prescription, like for arthritis people. The Voltaren is now over the counter. So I think the way reviewers view your product development is it logical? Is it feasible and likely to succeed in the way that you've laid out that plan? I saw a recent summary statement where the reviewers basically said they need to bring in someone with FDA expertise because the plan they have developed is not akin to reality. So that's when they view you as, whether it's over the counter or by prescription, that's when they kind of shut things off and say, go back to square one. And that was an unscored application. So they didn't, some reviewer took that application right down the path of, you know what, we're not even going to give this one a score. Whereas if you read the summary statement, whether it was the first or second reviewer, were actually a little more positive about it. And this is what happens in review. You can have one reviewer who can really sway the whole rest of the committee based on something that they're not going to budge on. So
a reminder then too, so like over the counter makes no claims, which if it makes claims, it has to go through the FDA approval process, if I remember correctly.
yeah, I mean, Voltaren definitely makes claims and it is FDA approved, but it is approved now as an over-the-counter.
Right.
That's why I'm not 100% understanding the question, and maybe Kathy could give it a little more color,
Well,
so I can understand what she's asked.
I've unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Kathy.
Okay. Well, I guess my concern is that we don't want to come across with NIH as not being scientifically driven enough, because the hurdles to get an over-the-counter product that we're looking at, it's an antiviral treatment. They're much less, obviously, than going the pharmaceutical route and having to go through the extensive clinical trials and so forth. We want to have enough proof to validate our product and be able to use that in marketing and so forth without making the claims per se. And there are ways you can creatively word that so you're not making a claim, but you're getting your value of your product out. So I just wanted to get a sense of, is that enough of a bar that the NIH officials would want us to jump over, or do they want us to go all the way? Conceptually, I know each reviewer is different.
Yeah, I mean, if you don't have to go through any more steps just to get your product into the market, and you have validated, and you remember many of those AIMS examples I shared had a validation stage, that's perfectly fine. I mean, there are some 510K devices that have, this pre-market notification, and they basically still go through FDA for that 510K designation, but it's very different than a drug development that has to go through phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. Reviewers aren't biased one way or the other. As I said earlier, what they want to make sure of is that the pathway you've chosen is logical and feasible and fits whatever product you're developing. Okay. A lot of the work that what used to be complementary and alternative medicine, and now they're NCCIH, which is the Center for Integrative Health, a lot of their projects that they support are not, pharmaceutical standard phase 1, 2, 3 clinical studies, because those alternative medicines do take a different pathway. So the other thing I would point out here is you want to make sure you get into the right review group. If you get into a review group who's going to be very drug discovery focused, then that could be a problem from the get-go. And again, we'll talk next week about that peer review process and making sure that you land in the right committee so that you don't run up against problems that otherwise could have been avoided.
So when you say make sure you land in the right committee and get the right reviewers, is that by appropriately choosing the right center or institute to apply to, or? I'm not sure how
So
you-
my point is,
Okay.
when you send your application to NIH, two things are going to happen. You're going to be assigned to an institute or center who's going to fund your project if it scores well, and you're going to be assigned to a peer review group who is going to not be part of the institute. These are academicians, these are industry folks outside of NIH who are going to assess the scientific and technical approach and do the actual peer review. There are a number of NIH review groups into which you could be assigned. You can actually make requests to go into a particular review group, and we'll work on how to do that. But my point was, don't get into a review group who is reviewing your application with a bent on drug discovery if you're really focused on some other type of pathway. And NIH is 98% spot on in terms of the study sections they will assign you to, but they're human beings, and sometimes you end up in the wrong review group. And so early on, you want to look at that assignment and say, wait a minute, I either asked to be in this other review group, or I don't feel like I've got the right expertise. Can we switch review groups? So that was why I was saying it's not so much the institute staff, it's the reviewers that I want to make sure that you guys are understanding of how that process works and how you can make a request and help guide your application into a particular review group.
And we'll go over that in the next.
Yeah.
That's a good segue into the next peer review process seminar next week, which, everyone seems to think it's a mystery, but a lot of the information is either in the application guide or on the NIH website. So it's just finding those nuances or understanding those nuances, which Joanne will guide us through. The other thing too is, again, keep in mind, we will guide you individually as you work on your proposal throughout this process to ensure that it is going to go to the right institute, or that it's going to land in the right review group. So you kind of have to trust the process with us a little bit as well. All right, so it's 11:26. If there are not any more questions, I'm not seeing any in chat. Joanne, I want to say thank you again for your time. The slides are amazing. And the discussion very, very appropriate and wonderful. So I don't think I've ever heard you do presentations, or it's been a long time. So it's really good to see how you present this material. So you all will get an email letting you know that the recording will be on YouTube, MTI's YouTube channel, and that a link to that the slides will be on MTI's federal funding page under resources. So with that, thank you all for attending. Appreciate it. And hopefully we'll see you again next week.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See you next week.